Good afternoon. It's about 2 o'clock here in Lindome outside Gothenburg, Göteborg. It's a very sunny day. It's still no doubt winter. There are no green things looking out from the ground. Yes, there is green grass, but oddly enough it never died. It was partly a very mild winter. I think the first ones we will be seeing are the snowdrops, we call them. Very beautiful little plant, delicate, small drop-shaped flowers. That's probably why they're called snowdrops. They are oddly enough a sort of leek. I will continue with Paul Johnston and his Rethinking the Inner, Wittgenstein, and I left off at page 4. Lacking an independent standard. Actually, use my jacket to cover my legs a bit. Sorry. So, it's the wind. Western wind. It's chilliness from the sea. Or damp. Lacking an independent standard, the individual's self-assessment is an empty charade, since she has no means of distinguishing what seems right to her from what is right. The notion of accuracy, and hence that of translation, cannot get a grip. But if this is so, why doesn't this problem arise whenever anyone translates anything? The answer is that the existence of a public practice provides a context within which seeming right and being right are distinguished. Within the practice, there are rules of translation and procedures for checking whether or not these rules have been correctly applied. It is the existence of these rules and procedures which allows a distinction between accurate and inaccurate translation. And so justifies our claim to be translating, as opposed to simply setting down whatever feels right at the time. The thrust of this argument is to refute the idea that the individual's expression of her thoughts is the translation or representation of a private process inside her. It also undermines the very notion of private inner events. For the reason for this is that if the individual statements cannot be seen as reports, the only possible means of access to the supposed inner events has been ruled out. Since neither we nor she can distinguish between her believing a certain event took place and that event actually taking place, the notion of these events as independently existing occurrences is undermined. In fact, the only thing that plays a role in the language game, and hence the only thing that can matter to us, is what the individual says or is inclined to say. The idea of independently existing thought processes on which he reports can be dropped. Well, it is astonishing, I think. Here, Wittgenstein says or writes something that is in agreement with no one on this planet. It is important, however, to note that this is not because the individual is unreliable, but rather because it makes no sense to treat her statements and her thoughts as two separate entities standing in a one-to-one correlation. The impossibility of a check implies a completely different set of conceptual relations. As Wittgenstein notes, it seems to me I have multiplied correctly does not mean I have multiplied correctly. But apparently, if it seems to me I have compared. What this shows, however, is that talk of comparison is misplaced. If the individual statements cannot be wrong, the claim to validity cannot lie in the being an accurate translation or projection of what went on inside her. The importance of this argument is hard to exaggerate, for it undermines our natural picture of the inner and calls for a general rethinking of our approach to psychological concepts. The argument challenges our most basic presuppositions about how we should understand the inner, and if these are overthrown, it is by no means clear what we should put in their place. The temptation is to switch to behaviorism, but rather than solving the problem, this only suppresses it. Despite the mysteries and uncertainties surrounding it, the inner plays a crucial part in our lives, and from a Wittgensteinian perspective, the point is to understand that role, not to deny it. as well as opening up a whole new set of problems concerned with the inner. Wittgenstein's argument also raises far-reaching questions about how language works. For if representation is ruled out, how does language operate here? If the individual speaks in a ruleless vacuum, how can her words have meaning? Paradoxically, however, it is precisely these words that can mean the most to us. Unraveling these problems will take up the rest of the book. And as we shall see, the connection between language and the inner is of crucial importance. However, before exploring Wittgenstein's positive account, it is worth considering the initial argument in more detail, and one way to do that is to consider the example of inner speech. One striking feature of inner speech is that at first glance it seems a blatant counterexample to Wittgenstein's claims. The natural inclination is to see it as a faint copy of outer speech. One talks as it were less and less loudly until one is speaking so softly there is no outer noise, only a sound in the imagination. Here there would seem to be no problem of translation, for X hypothesis, the individual's report on her inner monologue simply gives voice to words which she has already used, only internally rather than externally. But even here, the same problem arises, for in the absence of an independent check, there is no means of assessing the accuracy of the individual statement, and hence it cannot be construed as a report. From Wittgenstein. He is an accurate reporter on what the Times says, has a good sense. You check it by reading the Times. And he can check it by reading the Times. But he's trustworthy about what he really says to himself. Won't do for us, and it won't do for him. In this case, to seem to yourself to have said X is the only meaning I can give to the X. I can give to I have said X. Paradoxically, this implies that when the individual tells us what she said to herself, her statement cannot be seen as a reproduction of anything. Her words are not a report on a separate but private inner process. Rather, they must stand or fall on their own merit. If they have an interest. This cannot lie in their being accurate, because in this context the notion of accuracy cannot get a grip. In an attempt to avoid this conclusion, it is tempting to try to justify the individual statement by looking for some other criterion against which it can be checked. One possibility would be to find some physical correlate of normal speech which also occurred when the individual talked to herself. Suppose, for example, we discovered that normal speech was accompanied by certain movements in the larynx, and found that similar movements could be correlated with the individual's account of her inner speech. This would seem to confirm the individual's account, and so give sense to the idea that her statements are the outer projection of an inner process. One objection to this is that there is no guarantee that any such correlation exists. A more fundamental objection is that the reference to the larynx's movements introduces a new criterion and hence a new concept. Since this is so, the two accounts cannot be seen as confirming each other, Indeed, in calling both the concepts inner speech, we are simply inviting confusion. Consider the situation if the two criteria diverge. If we treat the new criterion as authoritative and say the individual was mistaken about what she said to herself, we would be abandoning our current concept of inner speech. If, however, we give the individual's account priority, we would no longer be able to claim that the physical data offer an independent confirmation of what she says. In fact, since the two criteria are independent, there's no reason why we shouldn't keep both. If, for example, there were larynx movements, but the individual had no account to offer, we might say that inner speech occurred, but the individual did not talk to herself. Conversely, if she had an account, but there were no larynx movements, we might describe the situation by saying that she spoke to herself and no inner speech occurred. Squeeze me. Wittgenstein is here pressing on a very important point. Inner and outer are maybe the most devious of all. disjunction. And the worst thing is trying to get rid of it. Actually, the two things are completely the same in what they do. They stop understanding, it's brought to a halt. We need to understand, just as in constructive mathematics, as exposed by Brouwer and Bishop, the relation between inner and outer is a miscalculation based on what is parallel to the law of the excluded middle in mathematics. See it as a sort of rule of thumb or intuition that we use, that to a certain extent is helpful to us, but also to a greater extent detrimental to our understanding. Disastrous, I would say, even. Of course, in this series we have already established that the idea of a perceiver and something perceived outside are nonsensical and extremely naive. There are hardly any philosophers who propound those ideas anymore. But Ludwig Wittgenstein is here pointing to something much more concisive and profound. That there is a generalized misconception and misuse of language that is very close to ignorance. Skinner's solution, behaviorism, just covers the problem. It's a half-witted solution, but you can also understand it was necessitated by previous understanding that made representationalism impossible. How can we know that the inner statements our thinking do correspond to an actual outer reality? Hari Yuvari, the Israeli researcher into irrationality, has looked deeply into this. He has conclusively shown that our thinking is not in correspondence to what is outside. It's easily shown when people are making plans and when they execute them something else happens. That goes to show that thinking and action was not in correspondence. What the person was thinking was different from what he was actually thinking. Otherwise, the plan wouldn't have failed. Even this far in the book, at the very beginning, one comes to an understanding that the most obvious that there are failures in executing language, speaking in a way that is understandable and correspond, must also be valid for inner thought thinking. It is extremely naive to assume that all thinking is correct, eloquently executed, and precisely fitting into reality or the movement of the language game. The more closely I think of it, I understand it must be great differences between different people. And that must be differences in degree of being able to accurately think and to assess one's thinking, to see what one is actually thinking. It's skill. And I think that it's an approach I will take in this summary, that skill doesn't take any part in the oversimplifications of the naive ideologies of neither reductionism nor idealism. They simply do not work or even make any sense. How would idealism work if there is no outer way of checking via rules or doings if the thinking is valid or not? It's almost like idealism is a sort of mental disease. I am exaggerating here, but still, it is a bit like saying I can play football without ever training. Not having teammates or an opposing team, nor a football field, nor a football, goal, grass, supporters, audience, referee, very important. It simply wouldn't be possible to have an idealistic football game. Neither is reductionism possible. Although a possibly more convenient solution, because indirectly it seems to be pointing to some sort of rule somewhere. But does it really? Instead of pointing with one finger, it's pointing with the whole hand, or indecisively to something it calls matter, without having any rules for what matter is. We might never know what matter is. Does the word matter even make sense? The idea that we know matter is naive but beyond imagination. No, we have no rules for the invented word of matter, which is obviously a misuse in the language game. And in the end, you're stranded with only an internal world without rules. Yes, oddly enough, they are in that aspect alike, that most important aspect completely alike. The meaning giving becomes obscure in reductionism as well. There are no inner nor outer rules to control meaning. So your words will explode as they literally do when you have a logic based on the law of the excluded middle. And just as classical logic is an impotent, useless tool for any thinking, nor even a good description of the outcome of thinking, idealism sounds good only for a couple of minutes, until you fumble upon unsurmountable paradoxes. what a sad state philosophy was in until the event of Wittgenstein. And how those sad, clumsy thinkings led to the very reduced mental ideas within theories of perception, neurology, science of cognition. For me, when I was studying linguistics and read the language philosophers that were very popular at that time in the 90s, I always felt that the word extension and intention were ludicrous helping tools to just fix ad hocly a solution that could at first take, without thinking, sound good. Going into those things deeper show directly that inconsistency and lack of coherence were two abdis or silla that need to be addressed. Either you're damned or you're damned. A cul-de-sac of thinking that couldn't possibly lead anywhere. What you need to do is go back to the before and see what mistakes were established already in experience before terming them or defining them. Redefining can only lead to more of the same problematic thinking. I think we put a pause here. I need to go into the sun again. It's getting a bit too chilly here. I think especially here in my country, Sweden, it's assumed that the ability to have pretty good thinking and, well, speaking as well, but especially thinking, is something that fixes itself. It cannot be improved. It is what it is. And that is has a close connection to a world at large, or a perspective from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel would have it. That has led to the disappearance of pubs in Sweden. There doesn't seem to be a purpose in having places where people converse, train thinking, or having an understanding of rules, enforcing rules. Instead, everything becomes pacified. There is a world neglect. I thinking about those horrific examples from cutting, the neurologist, where people have had some sort of hemorrhage or tumor in one of the hemispheres, and especially if it's the right hemisphere, there's a neglect of a whole side of the body like it didn't exist. I think we're suffering something similar in Sweden. Reality has become something that we don't care about. And I would say it has to do with this development, that image that we became hypnotized with. That thinking and language is static, and skill, intention, free will are simply things of the past, or are disavowed or disallowed in this thinking. And we take in these proxies. I mentioned on a philosophical, quasi-scientific level, the words intention and extension. But I think also on an individual, private dimension, we invent the idea that our words, or especially our thinking, has the same value as all other people, that they are comparable. So when I think ice cream, I think it in the same way as anyone else. That is sheer hogwash, and it becomes even clearer when reading Wittgenstein. What would even mean that everyone, I don't know, I don't even know where to start. And this is, I think so far, is best showed by Ian McGilchrist, that of the representation of the left hemisphere, where even the depth of reality is a representation of dimensions 1 and 2. As to make a cube, as to make the Z perpendicular axle in the Cartesian coordinate system. That is completely nonsensical. How could that be depth? How could an almost modern invention replace true depth? Like reality would have been diminished by an invention. All left hemisphere dominant people believe in that, and it's even more prominent among autistic and schizophrenics. For them, reality is purely a representation. It's getting a bit cold here. I don't think I can take 2 hours of this, especially now when the sun is diminishing and hitting 3:30 in the afternoon. page 7 on the first paragraph. I did stop mid-sentence once more, no, but in between two sentences. We'll try to avoid that henceforth. Examples of where the two criteria diverge bring out a more general point. For in a speech of which the individual was unaware or inaccurately aware would have a quite different interest from what we currently call inner speech. As things stand, our interest is in the individual's own account on what she said to herself. In other words, it is precisely an interest in an account where there is no difference between it seeming so to the individual and it actually being so. For this reason, it is pointless and quite misguided to seek a new criterion to justify our existing concept. If what we currently call inner speech does not involve any criteria independent of the individual, the introduction of one can only create a completely new language game. Any such game would not provide objective evidence of what really goes on inside us. Rather, it would replace our existing concept with a new one of a completely different kind. Instead of seeking an independent confirmation of what the individual says, Wittgenstein urges us to recognize the distinctive grammar of inner speech. Rather than viewing it as a hidden version of outer speech, he argues that we should treat it as a completely different concept, but one which has a tie-up with outer speech. To underlie this point, he describes a case where the differences are much more obvious. Imagine this game. I call it tennis without a ball. The players move around on a tennis court just as in tennis, and they even have rackets but no ball. Each one reacts to his partner's stroke as if, or more or less as if, a ball had caused his reaction. The umpire, who must have an eye for the game, decides in questionable cases whether a ball has gone into the net, etc., etc. This game is obviously quite similar to tennis, and yet on the other hand, it is fundamentally different. And I'll quote from Wittgenstein. It is also possible to imagine a further variant of this game in a tennis, where the two players play tennis in the imagination. That is to say, imagine they are playing tennis and describe to each other the shots they have attempted and how successful they have been in executing them. Each of these games is related to tennis, and yet fundamentally different from it. Indeed, in the second case, the game is no longer even a form of exercise. Furthermore, it presupposes a quite different set of qualities, e.g., sincerity and a realistic appraisal of one's own tennis ability. For these reasons, and in contrast with the case of inner speech, there is little temptation to say that inner and outer tennis are exactly the same thing. The fact that the practical consequences are so much clearer makes it more obvious that the inner version of an outer activity involves a completely new set of conceptual relations. To reinforce Wittgenstein's argument about inner speech, let us consider the special case of calculating in the head. The advantage of this example is that it is an everyday occurrence with a certain practical importance. It also has plenty of detail, as within a speech, the natural inclination is to treat it as unproblematic and to argue that calculating in the head and calculating on paper are exactly the same thing. There are, however, obvious and important differences. In the one case, the individual manipulates signs on a piece of paper according to generally recognized rules, and since this activity is public, every stage of it can be observed and checked by others. In the case of calculating in the head, however, all that we can observe is that the person concerned concentrates and gives an answer. But how should we describe the latter? On the one hand, there is a wish to say, and that is the description: he sits, knits his forehead, looks tense, and comes out with an answer. But this is one also wants to say, no, no. He did something else. He can tell you what. End of quote. Unfortunately, this something else is rather elusive. The only way to describe it is in terms of the concept of calculating. But here, even here, all the description amounts to is the mysterious claim that the inner activity is somehow the same as the outer one. But what does the same mean here? Simply stressing the notion of identity is no use, for the supposed privacy of the inner creates a gulf which calls everything into question. Although the individual may claim to be calculating, how can we know that this is correct description of her activity? Find some more sun. It's getting chilly. Furthermore, what can possibly justify her taking a word used to describe an outer activity and suddenly applying it to an inner one? To answer these questions, it is best to approach the issue from the perspective of a third party. It is important to remember, however, that the problem is not that the individual is unreliable, but that it makes no sense to treat her statements as reports on an independent process. As Wittgenstein puts it, I cannot accept his testimony because it's not a testimony. It only tells me what he is inclined to say. So what do we actually know about what does occur? Imagine we didn't calculate in our heads, but came across someone who claimed she could. What would we make of her claim? Treated as a report, it could only appear as highly dubious. Since in principle we cannot have access to the inner process, we would only have her word for it, that it occurred in her head rather than in her feet, or that it involved the same symbols as calculating on a paper, or indeed that the symbols it involved formed a proper system. Furthermore, the same questions that arises for us also arises for her. How can she be sure that she hasn't made a mistake and isn't claiming to be calculating in the head when she actually calculating in the foot, or when not calculating at all? If her statements are genuine reports, the possibility of error cannot be excluded, and yet, strangely enough, the idea of her getting it wrong seems to make no sense. Thus, the real nature of her inner activity remains surrounded in mystery, although she may claim that she calculates. This provides neither us nor her with indisputable evidence about the supposed inner processes. Since no one can check her statements, all these tell us is what she is inclined to say is occurring, not what is actually occurring. In the view of these difficulties, we might decide to reject her claim. It is significant, however, that if we leave to one side the question of what actually occurs inside her, her statements may still be useful. For example, if her answer tally with our calculations on paper, she might serve a useful function as a calculating machine. Despite denying that her statements describe an inner process, we might still make use of them. Indeed, we might say, who cares what goes on inside of her, as long as she produced the right answer? This is, of course, behaviorism a la Skinner. In view of this, we might agree to call what she does calculating, not because she says so, but because the results of her activity connect up with our practice of calculating. Furthermore, if she could also state the stages of calculating leading to the result, and in the middle of her activity tell us the stage she had reached and the answer so far, this would make the parallel with calculating even closer, and so give further reason for calling what she does calculating. It is important, however, to recognize that the decision to call this new activity calculating in the head is simply a matter of convenience. What the phrase does is highlight a connection between two quite distinct things. It might, for example, be likened to finding a set of lines on a wall and describing them as a drawing of a Greek temple with bits missing. And a quote from Wittgenstein here. This does not mean that it was connected with an actual drawing of one. It means only that it could sensibly be described as a drawing with bits left out. What he, the man who calculates, does can conveniently be described as he does something rather like what he would be doing if he had read the sum off. End of quote. Thus, if we did decide to say that she could calculate in her head, this would not be because her statements were accurate reports of a process which turned out to be identical to our process of calculation. Rather, it would reflect the fact that at various points her statements connect up with our practice of calculating.
Let's see here.
So, put a pause there. Well, in the book that is. I think this must definitely be compared to Barbara Tversky, who showed how thinking is doing and vice versa. One of her experiments were just calculating or understanding complex things like engines in a car, and people were using their hands while thinking, like they were doing an engine themselves, sort of tracing it out. The closer the tracing, the more accuracy from the hands, the better the thinking, was her conclusion. Of course, most accurate were the hands if the person himself had constructed or put an engine together. We cannot cheat with thinking. It only becomes as accurate and exact as comparison with the world as how much we do those things that we think. There has become a plagiarism when it comes to thinking. the mass society in education is one of the reasons that thinking has become monetized, and we, for some ludicrous idea, think we are thinking the same things, and of course saying the same things, that they have the same meaning, or as Heidegger and Wittgenstein would have it, use. Nothing could be farther from the truth. It's a piece of nonsense to say that person A says something and person B says something else, that those things are the same. They could be, but it is incredibly unlikely, because they have practiced in different manners and to different extent, and they are differently skilled. In the example of person A, his or her words might not even mean anything for others or for himself, not lead to success, not lead to ability to predict or connect to others or himself. So that's an incredibly important point Wittgenstein is doing. And of course, it's completely against the nonsensical analytical philosophy with its intention and extension. It reduces it to shrapnels, dust. It disappears in front of our eyes, just as the illusion it is really. Another person who clearly points out these discontinuities is George Lakoff, together with Johnston, who saw that mathematics is coming from how we treat our bodies. The different movements that we can acquire, and that mathematics is a specific skill that humans can do and can be developed as to look to be completely inside of the person. But they also show clearly it has never jumped into the inside of a person, and neither is it completely outside, nor both. Inside and outside doesn't really fit with the language game here. It's much, much, much more complex and intricate. It has a depth that analytical philosophy simply doesn't understand. And to use Wittgenstein once more, they could never understand. I would say that is important to sort of found first. The very idea that they could understand make all understanding of Wittgenstein impossible. They simply are not doing thinking, otherwise they would already be doing it. So you see here the monetizing of words and meanings is what it is about, not inside, outside, or idealism contra empiricism. And the monetizing or the universalizing of words is the same as neglecting the word. So word and world comes together. They are both ignored in this context. both left out of the scope of attention, and instead we have this narrow vision of the analytical philosopher, which always comes in hand with tension in the body. That is always present. The person is not very agile or flexible in movement, neither in thought. As Barbara showed, that is exactly the same thing. Your bodily movement are never better or worse than your thinking, because they are the same. And of course this goes with the theory of neurons, as they are connected like in the Klein bottle. The neurons are the muscles, but they are also different. T1 and N1 are connected as slow, deep and wide, whereas N2 and T2 are narrow, sharp and quick, and do not hold much knowledge. Well, I think it's time to finish. It's getting chilly here. The sun is slowly going down in the horizon. Look at that lovely sun though. I don't think I should overdo it. I hope the sun shines wherever you are. Have a very pleasant afternoon, and bye bye for now.